Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scribner, and today I'm going to talk about 10 books that I read in the third quarter, so from July until September, and what I thought about them and what I liked about them. And since I'm so terrible at doing wrap-ups and so terrible at doing favorites, I thought, why not just summarize them at this point, and then in 3 months when it's December, I will have this and it will be wonderful. According to my statistics, I read 61 books in this time, and I'm only choosing 10. So I'm going to talk about these books in the order that I read them and not in the order of ranking or anything like this. They're all very different books, so I don't think that I could really rank them, but these are books that just made me incredibly happy and I loved to read and I want to talk to you guys about. It's women who wrote, and it's a collection of short stories and poetry from authors that are women from across generations. I love classic stories and I love doing the history, and each one of these had a little biography to begin with, so we really got the lens of who it was, and I learned some great things about authors that I knew a lot about already, and I learned a lot more about authors I knew nothing about, and I really appreciated that we had a lot of ubiquitous authors like Jane Austen, the Brontes, Virginia Woolf, and Louisa May Alcott, and then we had a lot of work from authors that should be more well known like Phyllis Wheatley, Edna St. Millay, and a lot of other authors in there that I just really love to learn about. The second book I'm going to talk about is a collection of short stories as well. I really have loved short stories this year, and that was one of my goals, so good job on this. And this is by Danielle Evans, and I originally thought that this was a collection of sci-fi stories because it's called The Office of Historical Events, but it's actually really about contemporary stories dealing with race and the integration and interaction of the world with race and racism. And it was so well done. One of my favorites was this man who decided that he was a huge misogynist and he had done all of these terrible things, and he made an art exhibition about his misogyny where he apologized for people publicly, and how we deal with apologies and how we deal with things like that. It was just so well and so cleverly done. Like, her humor really shined. Another story that I loved was about a girl who was about 22, I think, and a child is just left with her, so she decides to adopt him and then kind of deals with the complexities of keeping a child that isn't her own. And then the work that lends itself to the name, The Office of Historical Events, is about a black historian who is living in the Washington, D.C. area, and her job is to go around and correct misinformation that is being spread. And it has a crux to do with a lot of racism and the way that people interpret these things. And, you know, she's really just talking and exploring the history of white supremacy and the way that lynching and stories about black people get told in history. The next book that I really loved is Ophi's Ghost by Justina Ireland, and this is a middle grade novel that was just absolutely wonderful. It's set in the 1920s against the era of migration from the south until the north, and we follow Ophi, who after her father is brutally murdered by Klansmen, leaves Georgia and moves to Pittsburgh, and through this she starts seeing ghosts and she starts experiencing these things, and she's trying to reckon what her life looks like with ghosts and the stories they have to tell, and the both sinister and friendliness of them and the sadness that history holds. And I thought that the descriptions were so well done. This mansion is so full of vividness, it's like dripping in description, and I felt very present there. And I love the mystery and the ghost story as well. I also think that black history in the 1920s is something that is not talked about nearly enough. The next book that I absolutely loved is CLINT Smith's How the Word is Passed, and this is a reckoning with slavery in America then and now. And it's really well done. I listened to the audiobook and I love Clint Smith's voice. He's also the host of Black American History on Crash Course, and I think that he does a wonderful job there. So if you're kind of interested in this book but you don't want to buy it or you can't have it available at the library, I think that that is a series that would be really accessible and free, that you can listen to him talk about American history through that. He's really trying to look at how America deals with racism now and then, and how it still has a lasting impact on society, that racism is not dead and that slavery is not dead, and the impact of that still is through, and how do we look at integrational trauma. And it is really well done in a poignant and intellectual but really accessible way as well. He goes between plantations and prisons and museums and graveyards, and he has conversations with guides, but he also has conversations with everyday people, and he really recounts what their experiences are like and talks about this as a lens to look into how history is retold and misunderstood and recovered by people who are the victors of society, and how white supremacy is interlaced into society. He does a really good job of adding the personal touch of talking about his driving and his feelings and experiences and how this affects him as a father or a husband or as a son, and all of these experiences, when also it stays away from the memoir. And I love memoirs, but I think that this is a very good book to have it as a universal kind of book on how it affects a large scale. The last chapter was particularly poignant though, where he talked to his grandparents about their experiences and the way that race impacted them. I didn't even realize when making this that I had a slight curve towards short stories and the 1920s and 30s, but this is just such a great collection of short stories. It's hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick. This is the collections of Zora Neale Hurston in the 1920s and 1930s. I previously read some of her work and plays in The Women Who Wrote, which was just brilliant, and this is why I requested this, and I'm really so glad that I did. It begins with a brilliant framework by Tahari Jones, who is the author of An American Marriage, as well as Genevieve West, and they kind of look through the stories in the introduction of how she impacted, how Alice Walker kind of rescued her from obscurity, and even though she was so prolific, she wrote so much. She wrote so much in her life and yet died obscure and without even a marked grave in 1960, and how Alice Walker and other Black historians and writers kind of really rescued her and, you know, uplifted her work. And I think that that's so important, and they're still discovering her work today, looking through like obscure Black owned newspapers at the time and finding her stories, sometimes finding stories that were never published or ones that have definitely been forgotten by time. I wrote a really long review about her, and I will leave it below because I won't have the time to go into all of this, although I should probably film one at some point. One of the best things about her is that she really reclaimed Black heritage and folklore, as well as AVAV, as in African American Vernacular English, or at one point called Ebonics. And she really did this in opposition of the New Negro movement, which was a movement of Black intellectuals and leaders that were really pushing toward people to be respectable, to be middle class, and to talk in a way that came off as quote-unquote white in order to be accepted by other people. And I feel like this book fits a very interesting intersection between the conversation of Black and Af, where obviously I'm not the person to talk about it, but from reading books, we really don't want to denigrate people who speak in African American English, because that's a completely valid and intelligent way of speaking. But we also don't want to tell people they're not Black enough because they're enjoying or speaking in a typical white way. Then we have the whole conversation about appropriating AAVE by white creators and all of those. It's a long, big conversation. I thought it was really interesting that she was one of the very first authors that kind of very much stood out and was like, no, I'm going to speak in the dialect, I'm going to speak in the way that we speak, and I'm not going to change my writing, I'm not going to change who I am in order to appeal to white audiences or to appeal to white sentiments. And I think that that's really incredibly powerful, and I love the way that she wrote. I think that it's at times very cutting and short, and at times it's very poetic and lyrical. Like, I almost listed this as a novel in verse, because so often, even though she's writing in prose, it's just so incredibly lyrical. And she does a good job of referencing biblical stories and a good job of referencing like King James English, as in like adding like these and thous humorously. And I just really enjoyed the way that she wrote, and I could write essays about this. I would love to write essays on this. If you have not read this collection or other Zora Neale Hurston, I really recommend it. I haven't read Their Eyes Are Watching God yet, but I'm looking forward to reading that soon. So the next book that I want to talk about is The Tradition by Jericho Brown. This won the Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for poetry, and I had no idea until I was halfway through, but I have no doubt in why this did it. It is so brilliantly wonderful. I love the poems so much, and I wanted to read them, but I actually don't have another device, and I didn't want to write out the very long poems, so I will either put in a clip of me reading the poems, or I think I'll be able to find access that is available for me to enter him speaking his own poems, which is even more powerful.
I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed, or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass, more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it the same way most Americans do. I promise you, cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain.
And I think that he does such a brilliant job, and he does a really good job of reframing and recontextualizing the way that he talks about language. And he will say something and then he will say it again in a different context, and it's so brilliant, and I really love the way that he writes. Like, I was just mesmerized by the power and the poignancy and the evocativeness and just the power and the way that he writes as well as the subject matter of his writing. The next book that I want to talk about is Lover's Vow by Elizabeth Inchbald, and this is a 1798 play that was originally adapted from a 1780 German play, so it's very, very old, but I really, really loved it. It is this very, very humorous play that I became aware of because it is featured in Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, and I really, really love this. I am really torn about what to say because I think the best way to do it is to go in blind. Like, I didn't know anything about it going into it other than it was a little bit risque, but it's not very risque for us. But I thought it was interesting and really emotional for the time that it was, and I didn't really expect it, and that it had a lot of feminism, and I wasn't sure if it was trying to be feminist, but she's just very straightforward and very open about the way that she wants to feel and the way that she feels about love and the way that she feels about other people, and it's very humorous in it, and I really just enjoyed it. And then we have the butler, who is added as comedic life, and he's great. He just like walks around a field and he's like, yeah, I can come and tell you about this thing. I have 40 lines as I walked across this field. And then he's like, some people can only talk in prose, but I can only write in poetry. It's more confusing if I try to talk to you in prose. And that is exactly my kind of humor. It's quite short. You can find it online. I read it for free because, you know, it's published in 1798, but I really, really recommend it. We're going to talk about Beartown and Us Against You. I kind of wrapped them into one big thing because they're of the same series and they're covering the same things and all of that, and I read them back to back. But this is the fourth book that I read by Frederick Bachman and translated by Neil Smith, and this deals with rape and assault in a high school and in a hockey town in Sweden. And even after hearing rave reviews for years and even watching Frederick Bachman speak about 2 years ago, I was still putting it off because rape is something that I'm very sensitive to reading about, and I think that he did a great job. I was so surprised as a man writing it that he wrote it so well. Like, he never described body parts, he never described kind of the visceralness or the trauma of it, but during the scene he really talks about, like, you know, her buttons were torn and the posters and how she's like focusing on these like really intense things and getting like the atmosphere around her and how much that's, you know, just like driven into her mind, but not necessarily what was actually happening to her physically. And I think that that is a really good way of showing trauma without making it voyeuristic or traumatic for other people, and I thought that was so well done. I love Ensemble Cast so much. I love that we got to see hope and radical hope in hardship, and that we had to sit in uncomfortableness and the layers and how and why people would lie to protect someone who they know is a person who assaulted a woman, and all of these things, and the different layers in the different generations. I love it so much. And also something that I think a lot of people forget is that it's really, really funny that there's this part in the second book where they're trying to get in and there's a bunch of old people and it's a hockey town, so they all go in, but they want to bring their beer, but they're not allowed to bring their beer and all of that. So the women are trying to sneak in this cooler and the guard is like, that's a cooler, you're not allowed to bring drinks in there. And they're like, no, it's not that, it's our cat. And he's like, it's in a freezer. Yeah, don't tell her it's dead. And I just stopped and cackled for laughing and then went back and then listened to it again. I don't know why this is my sense of humor. I think that I described it by the fact that I cried so gently and so fiercely throughout. Like, there was just steady tears, but then there was fierce tears, and then there were all the tears, and it was just so well done, and I was so emotionally invested. Lester by Raven Lolani is such a good book that I made an entire video talking about how I can't talk about books that I really, really love, so I will link that below or above or wherever. But this is a book that I really, really enjoy. I probably underlined 87% of it, and I haven't gone through and underlined it yet, and like kind of copied out those things, and I don't have it with me so I can't read it, but really I just love the way that it talks about the intersections of trauma and how trauma weaves throughout women's lives. Specifically about a black woman who is living in New York. She's 23 years old, she works in an editing thing, and she is in a relationship with an older man who is in an open relationship with his wife. We really talk about how race and women and all of these things interact in society and with each other, and it just speaks so true to how it feels to be an artist, how it feels to be a person who lives in the world, how it feels to experience poverty. Even though her experiences are so different from me, I felt very true in the way that she spoke, even if our trauma was different. And I really, really appreciated the way that Raven Lolani wrote, and I cannot wait to read more books by her. The last book I have on my list is Whereabouts by Jhumpa Lahiri, and this is a beautiful, beautiful novel. This is her first book written in Italian. She's an Indian American that was raised in Rhode Island and really just traveled around the world and had to experience a lot of upsetness in her life and a lot of traveling and not really necessarily being from one place or being accepted and all of that. And that really influenced the way that she wrote and the way that she told stories. And then in her 30s or 40s, I think that she started really learning about Italy and Italian and all of that. And then she started writing in it. And this is her first book. It was published 3 years ago, but it was translated this year by her. And in Italian, it actually stands as where I am. And I think that that's almost a more evocative way because it really has kind of the questions of where I am, but I think also whereabouts has the flexibility of the future and the past and all of this. And I thought the description that was very simple was very interesting and illuminating to kind of her story. It is an unnamed protagonist travels around an unnamed European city talking about her solitude. And part of it Jhumpa Lahiri talked about was the fact that she's traveled so much. What would it be for someone who had never kind of stepped outside of her own town? She'd never stepped out of her own experience. She'd never gotten married or had children, and where that was, and how does stasis and movement interact, and does she want something more? What is her life, and how do other people interact around her? And it is so beautiful and whimsily, and it's very sparse, but it's also so poetic at the same time, and I really just love this one, and I cannot wait to read more Jhumpa Lahiri. I've started Interpreter of Maladies, and it's already so good. I hope you enjoyed my journey through my favorite books of the third quarter. What was one of your favorite books the last 3 months? Please tell me in the comments. I would love to discuss these books. And please thank you for standing with me as my throat, I think, became a little bit less hoarse as I went on. I was like trying to, but my throat was just very, contemplating not wanting to speak. What kind of themes or patterns do you see in your favorites lately? And what do you hope to read next? Have a great time, and I will see you next time. Bye.